One of the premier racing games in my younger years is Diddy Kong Racing for the N64. From the characters, the music, minigames, all of it was so perfect that you never would have guessed that this game went through several genre iterations before even becoming a racing game to begin with. Or that the main storyline for Diddy Kong Racing, yes, this game does have a storyline, but it's not really about Diddy Kong at all. In fact, Diddy Kong wasn't even supposed to be part of the game to begin with. He's just a character that Rare slapped onto the cover of the game and the title of the game just to help sell. But of course, this is Rare we're talking about here. The kings of last minute development, the same company where when they were making GoldenEye, their first project on the N64, they originally took a single player game and had one man sit in a dark room for days on end. Don't even know if he slept, ate, or saw his family, but he managed to turn that single player game of GoldenEye into a multiplayer masterpiece. Instead of taking the entire game and changing it from single player to multiplayer, Diddy Kong Racing was always set to be a multiplayer game. But in the initial development, that wasn't always the case. Following the success of Killer Instinct, when Rare banded together and decided to split off the development team, one team working on Killer Instinct Gold and the other team working on Random Game X. Random Game X, which later became Diddy Kong Racing, went through a lot of changes. And in this video, we're going to discuss just that. The year is 1994 and Rare is absolutely crushing the video game scene. After proving their capability by reverse engineering the Famicom, Nintendo offered the two heads at Rare, Tim and Chris Stamper, an unlimited amount of funding to create several games. In total, about 60 games were developed during the late 80s and early 90s. Although most of these games did not receive much commercial success, some titles did manage to become breakout titles like Battletoads, a side-scroller beat-em-up, and RC Pro Aim, a realistic racing game that may or may not come up later on in the video. So when the SNES was introduced, Rare made the best decision any company could ever make, and that is to focus on quality over quantity. They dumped most of the money they made from the NES into these super advanced workstations to create beautiful 3D models, and these models were so advanced that the SNES couldn't even render these graphics properly. Rare themselves had to develop a way for the SNES to render the graphics, which did impress Nintendo so much that the company became one of their key developers. Getting the thumbs up from Nintendo, Nintendo told them, "Hey Rare, I want you to make a 3D CGI game using any Nintendo character you want." And so Chris and Tim looked at each other and said, "Give us the monkey." And thus, the Donkey Kong trilogy for the SNES was born. Now, Rare was now preparing to move on to the N64, where they made GoldenEye, Blast Corps, and Killer Instinct 2. This is important because right after Killer Instinct 2's success, their team was split into two groups. One for Killer Instinct Gold and the other for Rare's newest and biggest project. It was going to be their first self-published game. Up to this point, they've only been developing games but not publishing them themselves. This was going to be a RTS about a prehistoric time traveler, which bothers my brain because imagine playing an RTS using an N64 controller. Anyways, this was short-lived and the concept was scrapped and shifted to becoming a platforming adventure racing game hybrid. Try saying that 3 times fast. But with an actual title this time, and that title was The Wild Cartoon Kingdom, which later became Adventure Racers. Now, the selling point with this game was that the characters would be allowed to wander around outside their vehicles in a theme park-inspired hub world. Some of the assets from the original prehistoric game were kept, including a woolly mammoth that may or may not make it to the final edit. And another character who was also created during this time was Timber the Tiger, who was entirely meant to be the main character for this game. But we'll talk about that more when we discuss the game's story. the small size of the dev team meant that they had to dial back on the hub world and the platforming aspects of the game and focus more so on the vehicular player movement, which is a plus to me personally because I don't know about you guys, but I care more so about a great game that is a work of art rather than a game that is a piece of art that looks great but is very complex and stupid. I really hope that made sense. During the development process, they decided to change the name of the game once again to Pro Aim 64, making the game the spiritual successor to RC Pro Aim on the NES. But the big difference between Pro Aim 64 and RC Pro Aim is that RC Pro Aim was a realistic racing game with realistic tracks and realistic drivers, whereas Pro Aim 64 is a cartoonish style of game with varying vehicles and varying tracks that do not make sense at all. At this point, Rare thought it'd be a good time for them to start filling up that roster, and so they did. They have Timber the Tiger, who was inspired by The Lion King and based off of Tony the Tiger's son, Tony Jr., Pipsy the Mouse, who replaced a kangaroo character that was originally going to be named Roo and was set to be included, but was scrapped for Pipsy. And Pipsy is a bit interesting because her model is from another of Rare's canceled games titled Astro Mouse, which featured an angry looking mouse in a spacesuit. Then you have Tip Top the Turtle, who was repurposed from another canceled game from Rare. You're starting to see a trend here, but that canceled game was titled Project Dream. Now, Tip Top was used later on in Banjo-Kazooie. Then you have Bumper the Badger, who is a badger with sick glasses, and Drumstick the Rooster, who was inspired by Foghorn Leghorn and the chickens from the Muppet Show. He's also the best flyer in the game. Both Conker and Banjo were already created and set to be put into the roster, but that left 2 open slots for characters. And I'm not going to count Crunch right now because, I'm not going to count Crash right now because he's going to go through a bit of a change later on. But we have an opening for a monkey character and the woolly mammoth that may or may not make it to the final edit. Speaking of, that woolly mammoth did not make it to the final edit. Instead, it's replaced by TT, a hidden character of which you can unlock in the game. And unlocking TT is not an easy task because you have to beat every single race at least once, then go back and beat the ghost of TT every single time on every single track, except for the trophy races. But you know it's worth it because his soundtrack is absolutely baller. But with this powerful roster, the year is now 1997 and the game is set to release this Christmas. And so when it was demoed at E3 1997 by Miyamoto himself, he said, yo, this is a really good game. You guys did a really good job here. However, I don't think it's going to be able to sell that well given Christmas timing. So what Miyamoto has suggested is that they added in Diddy Kong, which Rare was very reluctant to do, okay? And of course you can imagine why they didn't want to add Diddy Kong to this game. It's because Rare wanted this to be their first self-published game. They didn't want to use any outside IPs. Everything else that was related to this game was entirely developed and created by Rare itself. And so them adding in Diddy Kong would essentially tarnish what Rare has been trying to develop up to this point. But if Big Nintendo themselves says you gotta do this, you gotta do it, or else, you know, you're gonna come into some static later on down the line. This change, however, did affect the story in ways that made the overarching plot of the game seem a bit odd when you're looking at it. You see, initially, it was Timber's parents leaving the island on vacation, and their son would then be in charge of the island, whereas Wizpig then shows up, takes over the island, and uses the island's guardians to become his henchmen. Now, the only way for Timber and his friends to actually go against Wizpig is by beating him in a race. The first one that tries it is Drumstick, where he loses and becomes a frog. Drumstick is also the best flyer, so this is a big win for Wizpig. To combat this, Timber hires a team of the island's inhabitants, and that includes Tip Top the Turtle, TT the Stopwatch, Pipsy the Mouse, Bumper the Badger, and what would have been Crash the Crocodile. But with the addition of Diddy Kong, they had to make some changes with the story and Crash the Crocodile. And so Crash the Crocodile then became Crunch the Kremling, and the story then became from Timber recruiting everyone to help out with the island to Timber initially recruiting Diddy, who then recruits Conker, Banjo, and Crunch just happens to follow Diddy because he is Diddy's enemy, which also pairs really well because when Crash was initially introduced, they just wanted some kind of an evil character that people can race as. And so, hey, he looked kind of cool in the airplane and a hovercraft, and so they went with it. And with the rest of the roster settled, all that remained was just making the game work well and look well. And they did a wonderful job. If you look here from the progression of the early tracks they have, this one is from Ancient Lake, you can see that they originally used assets from the first prehistoric game and built off of it. If you add in the fact that these assets look absolutely amazing from a visual standpoint, and that the music itself was created by the same composer who made the Donkey Kong Country series, David Wise, you got a game that not only looked good, but sounded good. But the real question here is, did it play good? And the short answer is yes. Although the initial goal was to make a game that ran faster than Mario Kart's 2D sprites while also using 3D sprites, the team managed to surpass their expectations. And the addition of the unique items like the magnet and hidden features that would give players boosts, such as the green boost, enhanced player experience each playthrough. And to make it even better, there were challenges outside of just racing and getting first place. You have the Silver Coin Challenge, boss race battles, trophy races, shadow races, mini games, even something small such as allowing players to go back to different levels and choosing a different vehicle that they want to play on. There was a lot in this game that lets you know that it was made with actual heart and soul put into it. They really did hone in on the whole quality over quantity thing.
Diddy Kong Racing. Crash test it now wherever you get N64.
In the end, the game became the front runner for Nintendo's 1997 Christmas season lineup. Diddy Kong Racing was awarded with Console Racing Game of the Year, beating out Mario Kart 64, Moto Racer, and NASCAR 98. Diddy Kong Racing was the peak of Rare. But I'd be lying if I didn't say that they felt salty about the game being changed from a solitary Rare project to having to use Diddy Kong in order to sell. What if I told you that Diddy Kong Racing was the last time that Rare had a good relationship with Nintendo? Although they did still make games on the Nintendo platform. And from there, it was all downhill for Rare. Now, if you're interested in hearing my take on Rare's story as a company, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Like the video so it helps the channel, and don't forget to save your games. I'll see you guys here for the next one. Y'all take care.